From Russia without love, Dutch investigators confirm it was Russian missiles fired by a Russian-backed rebel that downed flight MH17. As new figures show that of 3,300 bomb runs over Syria this year, 75% were Russian. The moment either a Russian or Syrian bomb lands on one of East Aleppo's last remaining hospitals. Good evening. Two terrible incidents. The shooting down 2 years ago of a Malaysian airliner killing some 300 passengers, and the claims that Russia has flown 75% of the 3,000 bomb runs over Syria this year alone. Dutch investigators have concluded that flight MH17 was brought down by a Russian-supplied missile fired by Russian-backed fighters in Ukraine, something Moscow has immediately denied. Whilst America's John Kerry has castigated Russia for deliberately targeting hospitals and civilian areas in Aleppo. Again, Russia is adamant it is fighting terrorists. Will anyone ever be brought to justice in either case?
Also tonight, the Health Secretary has won his trench war against junior doctors. The High Court rules in his favour. The controversial contracts are due to be rolled out, but who are the real losers?
We'll keep the red flag flying here.
The red flag serenaded at the Labour Party conference. Jeremy Corbyn promises a return to socialism. But what about a return to power?
So I ask each and every one of you to accept the decision of the members, end the trench warfare and work together to take on the Tories.
And Shimon Peres, the last of Israel's founding fathers, dies at the age of 93. He made his political career as a man of war. He made history as a man of peace.
And England's football shambles as Allardyce makes his excuses. Coming out of his home, he admitted he was silly, but blamed a media trap.
You know, entrapment has won on this occasion, and I have to accept that.
It was Russia that transported the missile that hit flight MH17 over eastern Ukraine, international criminal prosecutors said today. The Dutch-led joint investigation team said there was conclusive evidence that a BUK missile hit the Malaysian Airlines plane in 2014, and that it was fired from a village under the control of pro-Russian rebels. All 298 people on board the Boeing 777 died when it broke apart in midair, flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. Russia immediately denies responsibility. Our correspondent Jonathan Miller has this.
A block of rough-hewn stone with a plaque in Cyrillic stands in bleak farmland in rebel-held eastern Ukraine, in memory of 298 people who died. Halt and pray, it reads. Here, a Boeing fell. Nothing beside remains. Bodies and baggage and wreckage were scattered over 50 square kilometres when the Malaysian 777-200, en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, disintegrated at 33,000 feet at 3 seconds and 20 minutes past 1 in the afternoon of the 17th of July 2014. The Boeing fell into fields of sunflowers on the battlefield below. The answers as to the how, who and why have been fought over ever since. Now we know the how for sure.
We have no doubt about the correctness of the conclusions that we present today. And the conclusion is that on the 17th of July 2014, flight MH17 was brought down with a Buk rocket that was launched from farmland at Pervomaisk, and that the missile system arrived from the Russian Federation and was returned there afterwards.
The conclusion, in other words, confirms what's been alleged all along, that a Russian-made surface-to-air missile system brought down the plane. For 2 years, the Dutch-led joint investigation team pored over evidence in meticulous detail. Forensic evidence from satellite images, radar data, mobile phone intercepts, photographs, autopsies and witness testimonies. They ruled out all other scenarios. This was irrefutable, the investigators said.
Heeft een foto gestaan van het konvooi in Donetsk.
They presented videos of the missile system entering the Russian-backed separatist region east of Donetsk. 4 Buk missiles on board. Then there was film of the low-loader leaving, heading back into Russia later the same day with only 3 missiles.
Dat nu slechts 3 raketten op de installatie liggen.
The journey reconstructed with computer graphics.
De Buk Telaar is vermoedelijk zelfstandig.
Here, triangulated evidence from photographs of smoke trails taken by 2 different witnesses, pointing to this charred corner of a field, the launch site. They translated and transcribed mobile phone intercepts, in which rebel fighters give the convoy directions. In the Netherlands today, the report brought a measure of closure for families.
Up till now there were a lot of speculations, but I see this as something really a big relief for me.
If a missile is sent from Russia to the Ukraine for just 1 day, then there must have been a decision, and the decision is definitely cannot be taken by just a soldier.
Today, Russia fired back, unleashing a barrage of denials.
The shrapnel damage
The international channel Russia Today, widely seen as pro-Kremlin, citing doubts about most of the findings. The Kremlin insisting Ukraine is to blame. Ukraine's on the investigation team, the Russian Defense Ministry said. How can you trust them? The manufacturer of Buk missiles said a Buk had indeed brought the plane down, but that the aging missile was obsolete. The warhead no longer in Russia's arsenal. Today's report does not name suspects, but the investigators are now looking into who gave the order to fire and who ordered the missile deployed. The same sort of questions, in fact, being asked of Russia right now over its role in Syria. Some might say a pattern's emerging.
Jonathan Miller reporting. We're joined now by the author and Washington Post columnist Anne Applebaum and Dutch MEP Marietje Schaake, who sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee at the European Parliament. Marietje Schaake, what happens now? We obviously need the final report, but are there grounds for a prosecution of some sort, or is it simply going to be a blame game and that's where it stops?
Well, I think first and foremost, we must establish that this is very important information for the loved ones of the victims and the result of very thorough investigations that have produced clear results. And the investigation has always consisted of 2 parts. 1, the details of what happened, which were presented today, and 2, who is responsible. And I think the report that was presented today puts an end to a number of conspiracies that have been coming from Russia, and it is now high time that the Russian authorities cooperate to make sure that those who are responsible are brought to justice.
Well, how can you bring them to justice? I mean, you know, this is also going on in Syria, a Russian involvement, and there's no prospect, it seems, that they can be brought to justice in either theatre.
Well, at least we must do everything we can to make sure that an independent investigation looks at who are responsible and that the Russians at least cooperate to make sure that they are credible when they say they are willing to cooperate and to end the wild conspiracies that have been coming out of Russia about this terrible, terrible attack on MH17, which killed 300 innocent people. So I also think that this is an appeal to the Kremlin and everyone who is responsible for playing with fire, whether it's the bombardments in Syria or whether it has been around eastern Ukraine. It is very important that the Russian authorities change course, and they can still do this. And I'm very much focused on the results of the report of MH17 today. And I hope that this will be a wake-up call for those responsible in Russia.
So a change of course from the Russians, and yet if you look at what Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for Mr. Putin, says, nothing to accept or deny. We cannot accept as final truth of what they say. I bet you haven't seen any proof of what they say.
Right. Well, this, of course, has been the Russian line from the very beginning. Within hours of the crash, they put out dozens of different theories, some absurd, some crazy, about why the plane crashed. And their point from the very beginning has been to confuse the waters so much that no investigation would be able to convince everybody. In a way, they've been seeding the conspiracy theories in order to create this atmosphere of hysteria and sort of post-fact reality around the case. I think, unfortunately, expecting them to stop now is pretty unrealistic. They're very invested in this, in denying this, and they're very invested in really dealing with the outside world in this kind of way. This is now how they respond, as you rightly alluded in your report, to Syria. This is how they now respond to all allegations. We don't answer, we don't look at facts, we're not interested in the truth. We just offer you a dozen conspiracy theories instead.
But you have the Russians in play in these two theatres, and you wonder, is this the new world order? I mean, are you actually going to have a major power simply acting through subsidiaries and rocking world security?
Yes, I mean, I think that is what we have, and I think it's time that we began to face up to the implications of it. This is not a power that is acting in a way to increase stability. This is not a power that is responsible. This is not a power that wants to end wars. It's not going to they're not trying to end the war in Syria.
But does the West have any actual power to bring them to justice?
To bring the Russians to justice? No, the West doesn't have power to bring Russians to justice, but it's very important that the West continue to state the truth and continue to conduct reliable investigations so that at least the floor under the conspiracy theories is not so solid.
Shaka, Mr. Shaka, the best thing surely that could be done is to muscle in the whole of Europe when it comes to getting the Russians to do something about this. Do you think that the European family of 27 nations is capable of standing up to the Russians and demanding that something is done about this?
Well, I believe we must, and I do believe that today's report, once again, as well as Russia's role in Syria, should really lead to more leadership from the EU and from all 27. But the problem is precisely here that there are also governments and movements in our own member states that are being influenced by the conspiracies coming from Russia. And I think that this is a very dangerous development that we should be much more aware of and we should push back against, because it is not only having very bad impact in the Middle East or in Eastern Ukraine, but also in our own societies. And, we have seen, as Ms. Appelbaum also said, a number of incidents, conspiracies, messages coming out. And it is time that those who were not aware or those who thought that this would go away are actually going to be more engaged. But, to be honest, the kind of leadership and unity and ambition to be a global player is not present enough in today's European Union.
Thank you. Marietta Schaake, thank you very, very much for talking to us from the European Parliament. And Anna, thank you very much too. Matt.
Thanks, John. Now, Secretary of State John Kerry has told the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that the US holds Russia responsible for the use of incendiary and bunker bombs against civilians in Aleppo. Two of the city's largest hospitals, codenamed M2 and M10 by local doctors to hide their locations, were bombed out of service last night and this morning. Kerry has warned his Russian counterpart that Washington will end Syria talks unless Moscow stops the bombing. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon denounced the reported attacks on the two hospitals as war crimes. Here's Diana Magnay.
This is M2, one of 8 hospitals that early this morning were still left in eastern Aleppo. It's just after 3 a.m. Hospital staff are milling about until there's a hit nearby and they run. This CCTV footage shows what happens next. The hospital is hit directly. The lights go out. And then a much larger blast. Women and children stumble out through the dust and debris and hurry to the basement where they hope they'll be safe if the bombs continue to fall. Russia and Syria's combined air power, often indiscriminate, is sometimes all too precise. There were 2 hospitals hit overnight, both put out of action, which means that now there are just 6 left and 30 doctors.
The Russian planes flew over besieged Aleppo and started dropping missiles and rockets. People who were coming to get bread from the bakery, they were martyred.
The bread that no one now will ever eat. The blood which is spilt daily, the staples of existence here. The Al-Quds hospital is still standing. It moves location to escape the regime bombs, even if its smallest patients can't. What comfort is there in a mother's arms when outside the sky rains barrel bombs, phosphorus and bunker-busting ammunition?
Let us be clear. Those using ever more destructive weapons know exactly what they are doing. They know they are committing war crimes. Imagine the destruction. People with their limbs blown off, children in a terrible pain with no relief, infected, suffering, dying, with nowhere to go and no end in sight. Imagine a slaughterhouse. This is worse. Even a slaughterhouse is more humane.
Figures from Jane's defence analysts show that this year alone there were 3,312 airstrikes in Syria. 3/4 of these were carried out by Russian and Syrian air forces, 40% targeting Aleppo, killing almost 2,000 people. Since the end of the ceasefire, the bombings ramped up. The UN says bunker-buster munitions, which before were preserved for the battlefield, are now being used against civilians. And the US Secretary of State weighed in today to say he holds Russia responsible. We couldn't confirm that these craters were them, but a weapons analyst we spoke to said it was possible, the aim being to take out civilian infrastructure underground and make the rebel-held east unlivable.
They need to be quite precisely aimed to be useful. So I would guess that there's been the intention to hit either the utilities, so I can see that they've destroyed the water mains and probably gas mains and electricity going down the middle of the road, but potentially also some form of buried tunnels or something like that.
There is already a catalogue of potential international law violations on the ground in Syria, including the reported use of chlorine gas and cluster bombs, let alone the targeting of hospitals. But international law has never figured high on the agenda of any of the key players in this conflict. War crimes almost a meaningless term when the bombs continue to fall.
Now, the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has won a High Court battle with junior doctors over a controversial new contract. A group called Justice for Health had argued it was unsafe and unsustainable and that the government did not have the power to impose it. But the judge, Mr. Justice Green, ruled Mr. Hunt had acted within his powers. Next week, the contract starts to be rolled out across England. So what then? Our health and social care correspondent, Victoria MacDonald, has this report.
It was all in a word. A group of junior doctors argued at the High Court that the Health Secretary did not have the power to impose a new contract on them. The Health Secretary argued back that he was not imposing the contract, he was simply approving it. He did in fact use the word in Parliament and on this programme.
Said, actually, I'm going to impose the contract. The NHS have told me after a long process of negotiation they think is fair and reasonable.
But the High Court ruled he was merely introducing it and that everybody understood that. Today, the 5 junior doctors who had crowd-funded their action declared, despite the judgment in front of them, that they had not lost.
This is an answer that everybody has been unclear on for the last year. Is he imposing, is he not? This is a question that we as Justice for Health have asked for the last 7 months, and we finally got our answer. So actually, although even the judge had said in court that this answer would not have been given had it not been for this litigation, I think that can only be a good thing, and I have no regrets that we did this.
And they were backed by the new Labour MP for Tooting, herself a junior doctor until 3 months ago.
I think it's time to return to the negotiating table and come up with a nationalised contract that works for everybody. But what I am going to do is call for an urgent inquiry to find out why this was allowed to go on so long, cause so much disruption and heartache, if the plan was never to actually impose the contract.
The doctors are now facing costs set by the court at £55,000, though they are considering appealing. Mr. Hunt himself was not giving interviews today, but in a statement said he welcomed the ruling.
The question, of course, is what next? And all eyes will inevitably turn here to the British Medical Association. Now, they took many by surprise on Saturday night when they announced that they were suspending their industrial action, strikes due to take place over the next 3 months. It's also clear that there are divisions within the union itself, with some saying they should never have escalated it, and others saying that having made that decision to then suspend those strikes just played into government hands.
Junior doctors in England agreed to an escalated form of industrial action. However, when they realised how fragile our NHS is, how we do not have enough consultants or specialty doctors or other allied health professionals to keep our patients safe, they couldn't prioritise themselves and they had to prioritise our patients.
The BMA has not confirmed what the next step will be, though further strikes have not been ruled out, and there are some who also believe further negotiations will be possible. Tonight, however, a hardy few returned to protest at the Department of Health in a dispute that is far from resolved.
Well, we did ask the Health Secretary if he'd come onto the programme, but were told no one was available. We're joined now by one of the 5 junior doctors who brought the case to the High Court, Dr. Francesca Silman. She became a GP this very day. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Nevertheless, you lost, and one wonders whether perhaps you were rash in bringing the case.
So we actually achieved everything we'd set out to achieve. Back originally, when we spoke to our lawyers, we wanted to question whether Jeremy Hunt had the power to impose the contract. Today, it's very clear that not only does he not have the power, but he actually argued that he is not imposing the contract, was never imposing the contract, that no one ever believed he was imposing the contract, and he even argued that no junior doctor thought that he was imposing a contract.
Well, where are we then? I mean, is the contract going to be imposed?
So the contract is currently being introduced by the employers, but what the judge made very clear is through the litigation process, it's now clear that there is a window of opportunity for junior doctors to go to their employers and discuss with freedom, without Jeremy Hunt's overbearing shadow, to actually discuss what contract we should have moving forward.
But you're a doctor, so you're a realist. I mean, do you think any employer is even going to open the door?
So a number of employers were concerned originally about imposition. We know that the NHS runs on goodwill from staff, and many people have said, who are NHS employers, that imposition is a terrible thing to do to the morale of your workforce. Also, there's...
So you mean that are employers who do not regard it as their duty to impose this contract?
Well, I think the employers have made it very clear that it's important for them to have a national contract, but that doesn't mean this is the contract that they want.
Well, no wonder Mr. Hunt doesn't want to come on. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, he probably doesn't know himself whether he can get this thing going.
Yes, and it's very disappointing that a health secretary has spent all year misleading myself and many junior doctors into believing that we were being imposed upon with this contract. We went out on strike 6 times this year over imposition, and the chaos that that caused in the NHS could have been avoided if he had just been honest with everyone from the start.
Nevertheless, you must feel that the strikes themselves were damaging and that you perhaps overreached yourselves.
So the strikes have been shown to be safe, that no patients were hurt during those strikes. However, the disruption to the NHS was obviously huge. I think that's why at the moment we're not going to be further striking, because we know the NHS is about to go into winter in a terrible condition. We have nowhere near enough doctors to deliver services, and the hospitals themselves say they're running out of money, that the services are going to have to close. So it's not a time for us to be taking that action forward.
And
as decided
in a
by
word,
the
you're going to try and talk to your employers?
We will talk to the employers. We will continue to try and get them to understand how dangerous these contracts are for their patients.
Dr. Silman, thank you very much
Thank
indeed
you
for
very
talking
much.
to us. Thank you.
Labour can climb an electoral mountain, Jeremy Corbyn said this afternoon in his closing speech to the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. The Labour leader said his party had to be ready to fight a general election next year and appealed to it to end its trench warfare and take on the Tories. He also said there would be no false promises on immigration numbers, but a new fund for high migration areas instead. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, watched the speech.
75% of Labour MPs said they had no confidence in him and tried to topple him before he'd been a year in the job. The wider party just voted Jeremy Corbyn back in with a strengthened mandate. Today, Jeremy Corbyn tried to take on the criticism that a life of protest on the left means he just doesn't get the need to win elections.
So yes, our party is about campaigning and it's about protest too. But most of all, it's about winning power in local and national government to deliver the real change our country so desperately needs.
This week, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, was amongst those suggesting Mr Corbyn didn't get elections. Mr Corbyn acknowledged Labour had an electoral mountain to climb, but he said they mustn't patronise those who voted for Brexit. But he refused to promise any kind of immigration control, saying the problem was bosses underpaying migrants and public sector cuts.
A Labour government will not offer false promises on immigration, as the Tories have done. We will not sow division by fanning the flames of fear. We will tackle the real issues of immigration instead. That is the Labour way to tackle social tension. Investment and assistance, not racism and division.
Virtually none of the 63 MPs who resigned from Jeremy Corbyn's team this summer was in the hall. He's hoping some will now come back. But he said many of the MPs from the left who'd stepped into top jobs would keep them. The face of Labour has changed.
But let me also pay a particular tribute to those parliamentary colleagues who stepped forward in the summer to fill the gaps in the shadow cabinet.
The new team applauded that, as did the hall, showing their displeasure at those who tried to topple Mr Corbyn.
This conference should thank them today. They are our future.
Jeremy Corbyn condemned anti-Semitic abuse by some of his most zealous supporters. But his critics say it shows what dark forces lurk in his mass movement. But a Labour leader feels he has to say this.
Let me be absolutely clear. Anti-Semitism is an evil. It led to the worst crimes of the 20th century. Every one of us has a responsibility to ensure that it is never allowed to fester in our society again.
The most rampant applause came when he attacked the Iraq war and promised to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
British arms sales will be suspended, starting with Saudi Arabia.
Jeremy Corbyn promised more powers for councils to borrow to boost council house building, money for the arts in schools. But he said Labour needed unity to deliver these policies.
And let's be frank, no one will be convinced of a vision promoted by a divided party. We all agree on that. So I ask each and every one of you to accept the decision of the members, end the trench warfare and work together to take on the Tories.
Yesterday, the Deputy Leader, Tom Watson, said the party should be about reforming capitalism, not replacing it. Today, Jeremy Corbyn sounded like he was on a similar page. Much of the speech could have been delivered by his predecessor, Ed Miliband.
The people's flag is deepest red,
But he and his team often sound and look more strident. In their first troubled year of leadership, they've shown their inexperience. And Jeremy Corbyn returns in a couple of weeks to Westminster, where he's surrounded not by adoring supporters, but MPs who believe he's an electoral catastrophe waiting to happen. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool.
Well, now, Jeremy Corbyn's defence of immigration wasn't welcomed by everyone in his shadow cabinet, including Andy Burnham, his departing shadow Home Secretary. Mr Burnham argued today that lifelong Labour members had voted for change in migrant numbers in the EU referendum vote. Our political correspondent Michael Crick spent the day in Stoke-on-Trent to gauge how Mr Corbyn's promise to end false promises on controlling immigration numbers went down with the voters there.
When it came to voting for Brexit in June, few places in England did so more strongly than Stoke-on-Trent. Remain were trounced here and got barely 30% of the vote. Immigration seems to have been a big reason for that.
Immigration's a big problem.
In what way?
There's just too many of them. There's not enough houses and for our own people. Without keep rehousing all these immigrants that keep coming across and saying we'll give 20,000 houses to them and all this, and there isn't enough for our own people.
My son's been waiting 2 years for he's on disability. He's got rheumatoid arthritis and he can't get anywhere to live, and yet they can find foreigners who are coming in now straight away.
At the Labour conference in Liverpool, Andy Burnham confirmed he'll soon step down as Shadow Home Secretary so as to stand for Mayor of Greater Manchester. He highlighted Labour's problem with immigration.
This party must fully face up to this fact. Millions of lifelong Labour supporters voted to leave the EU, and let's be honest, they voted for change on immigration. We haven't yet even begun to show them that we understand why.
The estate was built in the 1950s in a linear...
Back in Stoke, in the last decade, hundreds of Poles have come to live in the former mining community of Bentley, with very few problems, says the boss of the local housing association.
This area has definitely benefited from immigration. 97% of our Polish tenants are in work. These results in the local schools have improved significantly over the last 5 or 6 years, and all our homes that we own are filled with people who are in need of those homes. So I think the estate has worked very, very well in terms of integrating, and it is now, if you talk to any residents on the estate, I'm certain they would say this is a much better place to live in now than it was 10 or 15 years ago.
A lot of Poles have moved into this area, I believe.
They have, yes.
And has that been good for the area?
Well, yes, I've got Polish neighbours and they're brilliant. You know, they please, thank you, hello, goodbye, not rude at all.
So you'd carry on letting Poles come into the country, would you?
I wouldn't, as such. It's control, isn't it? It's controlling who comes in.
I already think they should close the borders, to be honest with you. I really do think they should close the borders. I mean, that's just my opinion, you know.
You always vote Labour?
Yeah.
Would you change your vote if Labour carried on letting lots of immigrants in?
Well, yeah, because I've always been a Labour voter.
So Labour can say what they like, and you'll still vote Labour?
Yeah.
Michael Crick, Channel 4 News, Stoke-on-Trent.
Shimon Peres, one of Israel's defining political figures and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, has died at the age of 93, 2 weeks after suffering a stroke. Mr. Peres was one of the last of a generation of politicians who were there at Israel's creation in 1948. This morning, a digger in Jerusalem's Mount Herzl Cemetery, Israel's most illustrious. This grave will be for Shimon Peres. He will lie next to former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Bitter rivals in politics, they both brokered the Oslo peace accords with Yasser Arafat. Rabin paid for peace with an assassin's bullet 20 years ago. Peres was felled by a stroke, aged 93. Shimon Peres had spent most of his 7 decades in politics in the cabinet room, as defense, foreign or prime minister. Today they stood in silence and spoke with reverence.
Shimon devoted his life to our nation and to the pursuit of peace.
Shimon Peres embodied the creation and evolution of Israel. He grew up as a teenager in eastern Poland. He and his parents escaped to Palestine. The rest of his family were killed in the Holocaust. He entered politics in his 20s and became a protege of David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister. He made his name as a man of war, buying the sophisticated arms, especially from the French, that would win Israel's wars. Peres was also instrumental in getting France to build Israel's first nuclear reactor in Dimona. From man of war to man of peace. The handshake on the south lawn of the White House that promised so much.
To receive the gold medal and the diploma.
For their efforts, Peres, Rabin and Arafat were all given the Nobel Peace Prize. It was the Song of Peace that he sang with Rabin in Tel Aviv the next year. But moments later, Rabin was assassinated by an extremist in the crowd. And although the assassin was Jewish, everything now changed. Peres took over as prime minister, and yet the momentum for peace never recovered.
We shall continue our struggle for peace, and we shall try, while bringing an end to the outbursts of violence, to unite the nation.
In 1996, Peres was widely expected to win the elections. He lost by a whisker, less than 1%, to the man who still runs Israel today, Bibi Netanyahu.
Well, I shall continue to work for peace wherever I shall be. No change.
Over the years, Israel's position has hardened. The second Palestinian Intifada, the crackdown, the wave of suicide bombings on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Israel walled itself off, and with it all hopes of a meaningful peace with the Palestinians.
The idea, let's have war first and peace later, is like saying to your darling, you know what, first let me kill you and then we shall become lovers.
As president, a largely ceremonial role, Shimon Peres was arguably more revered abroad than at home. His 90th birthday was a celebration for a superstar who represented a less desperate era of Middle East politics. Blair almost got the air kiss, but Barbara got the best for last. His family says that he lived for peace and Israel, and his granddaughter knew that he would do anything to advance his cause, which included taking part in a sketch that she wrote for him in retirement.
אדוני הנשיא, סיימת כבר לארוז?
אני עובד על זה.
מצוין. חשבת מה אתה הולך לעשות ביום שאחרי?
את רוצה עוד משהו?
לא, תודה רבה.
סע לשלום. זה הפתרון היחידי.
Shimon Peres, who died today, aged 93. Well, earlier I spoke to former Israeli Justice Minister Dr. Yossi Beilin, who worked with Shimon Peres on the Oslo Accords. He was himself the subject of a conversation between Mr. Peres and one John Snow back in 2002.
But your own Yossi Beilin, your greatest political ally, is saying to you now, this is a horrible government, you must leave it.
Yossi Beilin was a pupil of mine. I think he was right when he listened to me. It doesn't mean that I shall be right when I shall listen to him.
Well, I began by asking Mr. Beilin, the former pupil of Shimon Peres, just how important he was to Israel.
He is very, very important, not only because of the fact that he was involved in public life for about 75 years, which is very, very, very unique, but because of the decisions that he took during this long period, both for the security of Israel and for the peace process. You cannot tell the story of Israel if you omit his name from it.
And you knew him very well. You worked with him very closely on the Oslo Accords. Give us some idea of what he was like.
He was pivotal in a point whereby had he not given us give us the authority to continue, it could have really easily evaporated.
So
now, he
Oslo
went
might
on
never
with
have
it,
happened.
And then there was, of course. Had he told me, Yossi, stop it, there would have been no Oslo. But he encouraged us to continue, and then a committee was established by Rabin with himself as the prime minister, Peres as foreign minister, I as the initiator of the Oslo process, and our legal advisor, Mr. Zinger, and we monitored as a group the negotiations with the PLO for some months in the year 1993. Now, again, it was very important, Peres, during these negotiations, and then he went to Oslo to finish the unfinished job because some of the issues were still open. And he negotiated on the phone for about 10 hours with Yasser Arafat. Until the morning, it was then a done deal, and the two parties signed on it in a secret way.
Now, the reality of relations between the Palestinians and the Israelis never lived up to the promise of the Oslo Accords. How upset was Shimon Peres by the turn of events afterwards?
He was upset, but he was not totally, he did not decide to give up on it, far from that. He said to himself and to others that this is a historic process. It doesn't end in one day or 2 months. Of course, we hope that it would be conducive to a permanent agreement by May the 4th, 1999, which is many years ago. But the reality was much tougher, and extremists on both sides did whatever they could, including killing Rabin, in order to torpedo the permanent agreement. And the hope of Peres was that it should be, it will be renewed.
But it has been kicked into the long grass, hasn't it? I mean, it's now more remote than ever that you might find some sort of settlement with the Palestinians. To what extent did that haunt him in the final years of his life?
Well, for sure, he did not like the policy of Mr. Netanyahu, and for a while he tried to convince him, and then he understood that there was no hope to convince Netanyahu to stop the settlements or something like that. But he never became bitter, and of course never gave up.
Former Israeli Minister Yossi Beilin talking to Matt a little earlier. Now here, Sam Allardyce has spoken to reporters for the first time since a newspaper sting cost him his job and claimed entrapment has won. The England manager had been filmed apparently trying to broker a $400,000 deal and telling undercover reporters posing as businessmen how to evade strict rules on third-party ownership. And a warning, there's flash photography from the very start of this report from our sports correspondent, Kamin Zeram.
Sam Allardyce made over £500,000 over the 2 months he was England boss. He was due to receive a total of $3 million a year for what's essentially a part-time job. So why on earth was his head apparently turned with the offer of dodgy consultancy work on the side? The tawdry greed of modern football. Although Big Sam, as he's known, this morning blamed the press.
On reflection, it was a silly thing to do, but just to let everybody know, I sort of helped out what was somebody I'd known for 30 years, and unfortunately it was an error in judgment on my behalf, and I paid the consequences. But, you know, entrapment has won on this occasion, and I have to accept that.
Allardyce isn't the only figure accused of being willing to work around the rules, according to the investigation that cost him his job. 8 current and former Premier League managers have reportedly received bungs for player transfers, although none have yet been named. The former England captain, Gary Lineker, today calling for a proper police investigation to clean up the game. The conduct of football's movers and shakers appears almost comic. An agent with form for match fixing secretly filmed, explaining how one manager would refer to backhanders as coffee.
For example, we do a transfer to as Rick I said, yeah, I want that back. Is there a little coffee for me, Peter? A little coffee? Yeah, that's what you're saying.
Football has an image problem. Today, the Premier League unveiling new funding for disability sport. The money swilling round the English game is immense, precisely why it's so lucrative for the hucksters.
That income has to be governed, and it has to be governed properly. And we have very strict rules in the game as to how that money is distributed, how that money is governed. And at the end of the day, there is no room for any malpractice.
Governance is one thing, culture change another. For it is still patently business as usual in some quarters to openly discuss the best way to circumvent the FA's own code of conduct. Just listen to what one ex-England manager had to say today about the undoing of Big Sam. Allardyce wasn't naive, he was stitched up.
And very, very sad for what's happened to Sam Allardyce. It could happen to any of us in high-profile sports positions. And, you know, Sam innocently has paid the price.
Could happen to any of us. Could it really? What is wrong with football? As Sam Allardyce leaves his dream job in disgrace. But consider this, with a rumoured £1 million payoff.
The German government is rumoured to be working on an emergency rescue plan for its biggest lender, Deutsche Bank, despite its own chief executive saying state aid was out of the question. Angela Merkel's government has also denied it's preparing to step in, despite fears that the bank cannot pay a $14 billion fine imposed by the US Justice Department for historic mis-selling. Well, our business correspondent, Helia Ibrahimi, is here. What's gone wrong with Deutsche Bank?
Well, rewind back to 2008, right in the eye of the storm, and the chief executive then said the bank would be ashamed to take any government money. But the truth is, it should have been rescued 8 years ago. Now it's this political football with massive implications for Germany, for Europe's economy. And if we take over the look at the last year, you can see that shares have actually crashed 50%. Meanwhile, short positions, now these are the bets hedge funds make against shares, they've spiked right up. So here you have Deutsche, the pillar of post-war German economic strength, completely undermined by fears, can't pay its debts, it's going to ask investors for money to pay these fines, and ultimately that Merkel will have to capitulate and bail out the bank.
And how serious is all this for all of us?
Well, let's look at something called CDS. You may remember these from the financial crisis. They're, in effect, the insurance against default. And Deutsche Bank's CDS trading now above 500 basis points. That makes it the most expensive bank insurance in all of Europe. And even if we want to look at some more basic numbers, let's look at the stock market value. Currently only around 16 billion euros. But that American fine you were talking about, now that's $14 billion. A lot of people saying that number is suspiciously similar to the 14 billion fine that European authorities leveled against American company Apple. Whether it's retaliation or not, Merkel has a really big problem because she can't let Germany's biggest lender fail, but she can't openly rescue the bank because she's been so hard on Greece and Italy.
Helia, thanks very much.
After the break, the story of the hellish journey to Calais for one Filipino refugee.
Well, after Monday night's dramatic debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, the Republican presidential candidate has been on the defensive in the media. But on the ground, it's still neck and neck in the swing states, like Colorado, where Hillary should be doing much better. Well, our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris, is in Boulder tonight. Kylie, it looks splendid where you are. What's going on? Why neck and neck?
It is splendid. I mean, it is trouble, though, this territory for Hillary Clinton, as you mentioned. I think she is enjoying a national bump as a result of that debate of a few points. But here her challenges are immense. We've just been out with Democrats who are trying to sign up voters to try and nail down core support for her. This is a state in which Barack Obama won the last two elections, but Donald Trump is really doing very well among oil sector workers, among energy workers. He's doing the work. He's been coming here for rallies and he's buying up lots of ads. So her challenges here is to make that grassroots campaign of hers actually stick. Nationally, as you mentioned, Donald Trump is on the defensive. I spoke to one of his surrogates. They're not pleased with that debate performance on Monday night. But this is a candidate who doesn't play by the ordinary laws of any election. He's been criticised for these comments that he made about a former Miss Universe. Hillary Clinton mentioned them on stage, calling her Miss Piggy, Miss Housekeeper. She's a Latina woman. But in response to that, he hasn't distanced himself from those comments. He's simply doubled down, referring to issues with her weight. But the problem is, I think, for Hillary Clinton, is that Trump supporters like this. They see it as an example of his strength and as an example of his commitment to them. It's worked for him in the past. There's no reason to think it won't work for him in the future.
Thanks, Kylie.
Former Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper urged Theresa May to take 500 lone child refugees in a speech to the Labour conference today. But it's not just the young who are vulnerable in the camp. Our reporter Porrick O'Brien has been talking to Pepsi. He's a gay man from the Philippines who identifies as a woman, and he tells of his extraordinary journey.
Hello.
He introduced himself to us as Pepsi, the queen of the jungle. And this is Pepsi's story, in his own words.
Theresa May, by hook or by crook, I will enter to your country.
But some advice. Leave all your preconceptions at the door.
I belong to to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front when I was young.
I see.
And I
And can you
escaped.
tell us what is that? Pepsi, brought up a Muslim, worked on the front line as a medic for the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, an armed ethnic separatist group in the southern Philippines. Then, in his early 20s, a job offer as a nurse abroad, out of the frying pan into the fire.
You know, when I work in Libya, I never go to school. I talk to Arab people, then I learn to
What do you mean? Did you used to work in Libya?
Yeah, I work there. Can I? Of course. Yeah,
What did you do in Libya?
I'm a nurse in Libya. At Al Kufra General Hospital in Libya. Hi, hello. And also Medical Tripoli Center in Tripoli, Libya. Hi. But maybe they surprised me now because when I was working in Libya, I have no long hair. Now I'm I'm member of LGBT.
He says he was comfortable in Gaddafi's Libya. But yet again, Pepsi and history collide. As the Arab Spring turned sour, he stopped feeling safe as a gay man. Rebels took his passport. He joined the Mediterranean exodus and ended up in a refugee hostel in Italy.
In Italy, do you remember the day that you decided to put on women's clothes?
On August 15th.
Oh, really? You remember the day exactly?
On August the 15th, 2014, he walked down the stairs into the refugee hostel reception.
And then I wear a sexy dress, and the people they were shocked. Oh my God. Then they said, maybe he wants, because I want to be transparent and I want to be real, truth on myself. My lipstick.
Pepsi identifies as a woman, but has asked us to use the word he. His ultimate destination was the UK, so to Calais.
I put like this because just self-defense, because maybe somebody will stone me.
He felt liberated by Europe, but the jungle Calais for Pepsi started feeling far from Europe.
This camp is, most of them are conservative Muslim. Yeah, I have many difficult experience here. Discrimination being member of LGBT, discrimination being alone Filipino here in the camp.
Pepsi's story is about to take an unexpected dark turn. It is not the final chapter, just the one that changed everything.
Tell me about the dark times.
They do by force for me.
What do you mean, Pepsi?
If you're being raped by force, that is the dark time.
Pepsi, are you saying that that's what's happened to you here in the jungle?
Yeah.
Pepsi says he was raped by 6 men at knife point. They brought him to a remote place under the pretense that they could smuggle him to the UK.
And we go there and farm around 4 hours to walk, and then the accident will happen. I cannot, because they are 6, they are knife.
It was no accident. After the attack, Pepsi decided to give up on the UK and has applied for asylum in France. Officials encouraged him to press charges, but he didn't, because the men were connected with smugglers in the camp. He was placed in safer container accommodation.
Welcome to my mansion.
In the Sudanese school, Pepsi is learning French. The word for today, magnificent.
Magnifique.
The Extraordinary Odyssey of Pepsi, as told by Porrick O'Brien.
And that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.